What if a standard cancer treatment could be improved, I mean, significantly improved, maybe giving patients nearly 2 extra years without their disease getting worse?
That's a big question,
It is, and we dove into a new study trying to understand exactly that.
right?
So, this deep dive looks at the latest research on treating newly diagnosed multiple myeloma in adults. We're drawing from a research article called Triplet Therapy, Transplantation, and Maintenance Until Progression in Myeloma.
Yeah, a very important study. Our goal today is really to get to the heart of what this study found.
What does it mean for people, just starting treatment for myeloma?
Exactly. And what questions are still out there? We want to cut through some of the medical complexity and find the clear takeaways.
Okay, let's unpack this. The study basically compared two main ways to start treatment.
Two frontline strategies, yeah.
So, one group got this combination of three drugs: lenalidomide, bortezomib, and dexamethasone, RVD for short.
RVD, right? A standard triplet.
And they followed that with just lenalidomide as maintenance therapy. The other group had an extra step, a pretty intensive one. After the RVD, they got high-dose chemo, specifically melphalan, and then an autologous stem cell transplant, ASCT, using their own stem cells back.
And then they also got the lenalidomide maintenance, same as this first group.
Right, so the core drugs were similar initially, but group 2 added that big step, the transplant.
And the big question, the one that researchers really wanted to answer, was whether adding that high-dose chemo and transplant right at the beginning
Followed by the long-term maintenance.
gave patients a real measurable advantage compared to just sticking with the RVD combination and then maintenance.
So how did they figure this out? Let's dig into the study design. Who was in it?
Okay, so this is a phase 3 trial,
Yeah.
randomized, open label,
Meaning?
meaning it's a large study comparing treatments.
Hmm.
Patients were randomly put into one group or the other. And importantly, everyone knew this treatment they were getting. It wasn't blinded.
Got it. And this was across the U.S.
Yeah, 56 different clinical sites. It involved adults aged 18 up to 65 who were newly diagnosed with myeloma that was causing symptoms.
And were there people they didn't include?
Oh, definitely. They excluded patients who'd already had systemic therapy for myeloma or if the myeloma had spread to their brain or spinal cord.
Okay.
Also, people with primary amyloidosis, which is related but different, or those whose organs weren't working well enough for these intensive treatments.
Right. So a specific group of newly diagnosed, relatively fit patients under 65. What happened once they were in?
So everyone, regardless of which group they'd end up in, started with one cycle of that RVD drug combo.
One cycle first. Okay.
Then after that first cycle, they were randomized, randomly assigned one-to-one either to the RVD alone path or the path including the transplant.
And did they try to make the groups fair?
Yes. They used stratification. They balanced the groups based on the ISS stage, that's the International Staging System for Myeloma Severity, and also based on their cytogenetic risk profile.
Ah, the genetic changes in the myeloma cells. High risk versus standard risk.
Exactly, because those factors are known to affect outcomes. So they wanted the groups comparable on those points from the start.
Makes sense. So what did the treatment actually involve for each group after that first RVD cycle and the randomization?
Okay, so the RVD alone group got 2 more cycles of RVD. Then, interestingly, they collected stem cells.
Even though they weren't getting an immediate transplant.
Right, sort of as a backup, just in case they needed them down the line if the myeloma relapsed. Then they got 5 more cycles of RVD, so 8 cycles total, plus the stem cell collection.
Okay. And the transplant group.
They also got 2 more RVD cycles after the first one, partly to mobilize those stem cells for collection. Then they had the high-dose melphalan chemotherapy, followed by getting their collected stem cells back the transplant itself,
The ASCT part.
the ASCT. And after recovering from that, they received 2 more cycles of RVD, kind of a consolidation.
So different paths after that initial shared cycle, but then the maintenance was the same.
Crucially, yes. Both groups then started on lenalidomide maintenance therapy. And the plan was for them to stay on it until their myeloma progressed, or they had side effects they couldn't handle, or, they chose to leave the trial.
And they followed these patients for a long time.
They did, yeah. The median follow-up time was 76 months. That's over 6 years,
Wow.
which gives you a really good long-term picture.
Uh,
Number-wise, it was 357 patients in the RVD alone arm and 365 in the transplantation arm.
and were the groups pretty well matched at the beginning? You mentioned the stratification.
Yeah, overall, they were quite similar. Baseline characteristics like age, sex, race, general health status, what we call ECOG performance status, BMI, myeloma type, disease stage, cytogenetic risk,
Mm.
all generally balanced.
Any small differences?
There was a slight, maybe noticeable difference in age. About 34% of the RVD alone group were 60 or older, compared to about 28% in the transplant group. Not a huge gap, but maybe worth noting.
Okay.
And importantly, about 20% in both groups had those high-risk cytogenetics we mentioned. That turns out to be pretty key later on.
All right, so we've got the setup. The solid study design, well-matched groups. What about the main results? Progression-free survival? How long did patients live without the myeloma getting worse?
This is really where the headline finding is. There was a significant difference. The group that got the transplant had much longer progression-free survival, the PFS.
So much longer.
The median PFS in the transplant group was 67.5 months. Compare that to 46.2 months in the RVD alone group.
Whoa, okay. 67.5 versus 46.2, that's what, 21 months difference? Nearly 2 years on average.
Exactly. It's a substantial difference in the median time until progression. The stats back it up, too. The hazard ratio was 1.53.
Meaning?
It means the risk of progressing or dying was about 53% higher in the RVD alone group compared to the transplant group at any given time point. Highly statistically significant.
So looking at it maybe percentage-wise, at, say, 5 years.
Yeah, at 5 years, 58.4% of patients in the transplant group were alive without progression versus only 41.6% in the RVD alone group.
That's a pretty stark contrast. A clear win for the transplant group on keeping the myeloma at bay longer.
Definitely for PFS.
Now, you mentioned those high-risk cytogenetics earlier. Did the transplant make a difference specifically for them?
It really did. The benefit, the PFS advantage with the transplant, was particularly pronounced in that high-risk subgroup.
How so?
Well, for those high-risk patients, the median PFS was 55.5 months if they got the transplant,
Okay.
compared to just 17.1 months if they were in the RVD alone group.
Wow. 55 months versus 17 months for high risk? That's huge.
It's a massive difference.
Mm.
It strongly suggests that for patients with those higher risk features, upfront transplant might be especially important for controlling the disease longer.
That's a really critical finding.
Oh.
Okay, so PFS clearly favored the transplant. What about just the initial response? How well did the treatments knock the myeloma down to begin with?
Interestingly, the initial response rates were actually very high and very similar in both groups. Yeah. The overall response rate, meaning at least a partial response, was 95% in the RVD alone group and 97.5% in the transplant group. Basically the same, statistically speaking.
Okay. What about deeper responses, like a complete response?
Same story there, really. Complete response, or that very deep response, was seen in 42% of the RVD alone group and about 47% of the transplant group. Again, not a statistically significant difference.
So both treatments were excellent at getting that initial control.
Highly effective up front, yes.
But did the responses last as long?
That's where we see a difference again, echoing the PFS finding. The median duration of response was significantly longer in the transplant group. It was 56.4 months versus 38.9 months for the RVD alone group.
I see. So the responses achieved with transplant tended to hold up longer.
That's right. And if you look out at 5 years, a higher percentage of the transplant patients were still maintaining that deep, complete response or better, about 61% versus 53%.
Okay, so similar initial punch, but more staying power with the transplant in terms of response duration. Now, the study also looked at MRD, minimal residual disease. What's the story there?
Right, MRD. This is such a key area now. The preliminary analysis here showed that when patients started their maintenance therapy, more patients in the transplant group had undetectable MRD.
Meaning tests couldn't find any myeloma cells left.
Using very sensitive tests, exactly. It was 54% undetectable in the transplant group versus 40% in the RVD alone group at that point.
Okay, so transplant led to deeper remissions more often, measured by MRD.
It seems so. And what's really fascinating is this. For the patients who did achieve undetectable MRD, their 5-year progression-free survival was actually pretty similar, whether they got the transplant or not.
Wait, really? So if you got to MRD negative, it didn't matter as much how you got there in terms of PFS?
In this preliminary analysis, that's what it suggests. But if your MRD was still detectable, your PFS was worse in both groups.
Huh. That really highlights the importance of getting to MRD negative, doesn't it? Maybe even more than the specific initial treatment strategy itself.
It certainly points in that direction. It suggests MRD status could be a powerful predictor, maybe even a goal of therapy we should be aiming for, and perhaps tailoring treatment based on. It's still early days for using it quite like that in standard practice, but the data is compelling.
Very interesting. Okay, so we have a clear PFS benefit, deeper responses, better MRD negativity with transplant. But the big one, overall survival. Did patients live longer?
And this is where the story takes a turn. Despite the clear PFS advantage after that median follow-up of over 6 years, the study did not find a statistically significant difference in overall survival between the two groups.
No difference. Really?
Not statistically, no. The
Mm.
5-year survival rate was very similar, 79.2% for RVD alone and 80.7% for the transplant group. The hazard ratio for death was 1.10, but the confidence interval crossed 1, meaning we can't rule out that the small difference seen was just due to chance.
Wow. Okay. So patients stayed in remission almost 2 years longer on average with the transplant, but ultimately they didn't live significantly longer overall in this trial timeframe.
That's the key finding on overall survival.
Why? Why would that be? That seems counterintuitive.
It does, and there are likely several reasons. But before we get into that, it's worth noting one nuance. In that high-risk cytogenetic subgroup we keep coming back to.
Yes.
While not statistically significant for the whole study, the 5-year overall survival was numerically higher in the transplant group for those high-risk patients. It was about 63.4% versus 54.3%.
Okay, so maybe a hint of a survival benefit there for the highest risk patients, but not proven definitively for the whole group.
Correct.
All right, let's talk downsides then. Transplant is a more intense procedure. What about safety side effects?
Yeah, as you'd expect, there was a cost in terms of toxicity. The transplant group had a significantly higher rate of serious, grade 3 or higher, treatment-related adverse events.
How much higher?
It was 94.2% in the transplant group compared to 78.2% in the RVD alone group.
Wow, almost everyone in the transplant group had a serious side effect at some point. What kind?
Mostly hematologic issues with blood counts, like low white cells, low platelets. That's common after high-dose chemo and transplant. They also saw higher rates of serious side effects specifically related to the RVD drugs and more serious infections during the maintenance phase after transplant.
Okay, so more blood count problems, more serious infections. What about longer-term risks? Anything pop up there?
Well, the overall rate of getting a second unrelated cancer wasn't significantly different between the groups. However,
Uh-oh.
there was a statistically significant higher incidence of treatment-related myeloid neoplasms, things like acute myeloid leukemia, AML, or myelodysplastic syndromes, MDS.
In the transplant group?
Yes, it occurred in 2.7% of the transplant patients versus 0% in the RVD alone group over this follow-up period. That's a known, though relatively small, risk associated with the high-dose melphalan used for transplant.
Okay, 2.7% risk of a serious secondary cancer. That's definitely part of the calculation. And quality of life.
The study did look at that. Patients in the transplant group understandably had a temporary dip in their quality of life right around the time of the transplant procedure itself. But the data suggests they recovered, and maybe even had slightly better quality of life later on during maintenance, potentially because their disease was controlled longer. But there's definitely a short-term hit.
Right, so it sounds like a classic trade-off. Longer disease control, but higher risk of immediate side effects, a small but real risk of secondary cancers later, and a temporary hit to quality of life.
That sums it up pretty well.
Now, you mentioned reasons why overall survival might not be different. Myeloma often comes back, right? What happens after the initial treatment?
This is absolutely critical to understanding the overall survival results. What happened next matters hugely. A higher percentage of patients in the RVD alone group eventually needed subsequent therapy outside the trial protocol because their myeloma progressed.
Okay, that makes sense.
And here's the kicker. A significant number of those patients in the RVD alone group actually received an autologous stem cell transplant at the time of their relapse.
Ah, so the group that didn't get it up front often got it later anyway.
Exactly. They received it as a second-line therapy. So if effective salvage therapies, including transplant, are available at relapse, it can definitely muddy the waters when looking for an initial treatment strategy's impact on overall survival.
That makes a huge difference in interpreting the results. Did the researchers try to account for that?
They did. They performed what's called a post hoc sensitivity analysis, trying to factor in those subsequent therapies. And when they did that, they still found a significant benefit for the upfront transplant group in terms of event-free survival. Basically time until progression or needing a new treatment. But the size of that benefit was somewhat smaller than the original PFS benefit once you account for the fact that the other group could get transplant later.
I see. So the upfront benefit is still there, but maybe not quite as large when you consider the whole treatment journey. Now, this isn't the first big study on this, right? There was the IFM 2009 trial. How did these results stack up?
Good point.
Yeah.
Yes, the determination trial, the one we're discussing, essentially confirms the main PFS finding from that earlier French IFM 2009 trial. Both showed that upfront ASCT leads to longer remission.
Okay, confirmation there. Any differences?
A key difference, actually. The median PFS times in both arms of determination were significantly longer than in IFM 2009.
Why would that be?
The main hypothesis is the maintenance therapy. In determination, lenalidomide maintenance was given until progression in both groups. In IFM 2009, it was only given for 1 year.
Ah, so continuous maintenance seems to really extend remissions for everyone, transplant or not.
It certainly appears that way. Right. And, just like determination, the IFM 2009 trial also failed to show an overall survival benefit for upfront transplant, despite the PFS advantage. So the pattern holds across both large studies.
Okay, so putting it all together, what are the main takeaways? What does this study really tell us?
Well, it gives strong evidence supporting ASCT as part of first-line therapy for eligible patients, if the goal is to achieve the longest possible initial remission, the longest PFS. That benefit seems particularly strong for high-risk patients. But the lack of an overall survival benefit is also a crucial finding. It really underscores how effective our subsequent lines of therapy for myeloma have become, including using transplant at relapse. It suggests we can often catch up later if needed.
And the MRD findings seem really important, too.
Absolutely. It highlights the growing importance of MRD negativity. Achieving that deep, undetectable state seems powerfully linked to better long-term outcomes, perhaps even more so than the initial treatment path chosen. This points towards a future of more personalized therapy, maybe using MRD to guide decisions.
So looking ahead, what are the next steps? What are researchers focusing on now?
There's a lot of ongoing work trying to understand specific genetic mutations better to predict responses. Looking closely at outcomes of different groups, the study mentioned they're analyzing outcomes in Black patients specifically, where there might be different results, which needs careful study.
Right.
And also looking at factors like BMI, patient frailty. How do those influence the best approach? Ultimately, the decision about upfront transplant remains complex. It requires balancing that PFS benefit against the toxicities, the treatment burden, patient preferences, quality of life considerations. It's a very individualized discussion.
So for you, the listener, let's try to boil it down. The key takeaway seems to be adding a stem cell transplant upfront to RVD for newly diagnosed myeloma generally leads to a longer first remission, potentially significantly longer, especially when followed by continuous lenalidomide maintenance.
Yes, longer PFS.
But at least based on this major study and the previous IFM trial, that longer first remission doesn't necessarily translate into living longer overall. Why? Likely because treatments given later, when the myeloma eventually relapses, are quite effective and often include a transplant for those who didn't get one initially.
That seems to be the prevailing interpretation.
So the decision involves weighing that longer remission against the definite short-term downsides of transplant. More side effects, potential quality of life dip, a small risk of later cancers, and considering individual factors like your risk status and how important that MRD negative goal is becoming.
Precisely. It's a discussion to have with your doctor, weighing all those pros and cons in your specific situation.
And this leads us to a really interesting final thought, maybe something provocative for you to consider.
Yeah.
With therapies getting better and better, and with this increasing focus on MRD negativity, could we be moving towards a future where the intensity of initial treatment isn't just based on risk factors like cytogenetics, but also on how deep a response a patient achieves early on? Like an adaptive approach.
Yeah. Could we maybe de-escalate or escalate therapy, potentially changing the role or timing of transplant, based on whether someone quickly reaches MRD negativity or not? If subsequent therapies are so effective, how do we best balance wanting that long initial remission against the upfront toxicity, especially if we can effectively salvage later?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Tailoring intensity based on response, maybe guided by MRD. That seems like where the field might be heading. Lots still to figure out.
Definitely lots to consider. If you want to dig deeper into multiple myeloma treatment or stem cell transplantation, the research article we talked about today is a great resource. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.